April 1967. The morning mist still clung to the valleys of Wiltshire when the first convoy of trucks rolled through the wrought-iron gates of Longleat House. Local villagers stopped their morning routines to watch, sensing something extraordinary was happening. The trucks carried cargo that would have seemed impossible, utterly mad, just months before. Lions, actual African lions, their golden bodies visible through the bars of their transport cages, destined to roam freely on British soil for the first time in 10,000 years. The 6th Marquess of Bath, Henry Thynne, stood near the entrance to what had once been a deer park, watching as workers in protective gear unloaded the predators that he hoped, prayed, would save his family's 400-year legacy. He was 62 years old and gambling everything on an idea so radical that other aristocrats had called him insane. 21 years earlier, in 1946, he had inherited not just a house but an impossible burden, death duties so crushing they could have ended centuries of unbroken family ownership. He had sold and sold, watching vast estates accumulated over generations disappear to pay the taxman, watching his inheritance shrink until only the core remained, Longleat House and its immediate parkland. But Henry Thynne refused to let Longleat die. He had already done the unthinkable, opening his ancestral home to the public in 1949, turning private sanctuary into commercial attraction, enduring the sneers of his own class, who saw him as a traitor to aristocratic dignity. And now, 18 years later, he was doing something even more audacious. What he created that April morning would revolutionize how Britain's aristocracy survived in the modern age, would turn Longleat into a household name, would prove that heritage and innovation could coexist. This is the story of Longleat, the Elizabethan Prodigy house that became the first stately home to open commercially to the public and launch the first safari park outside Africa, a palace that transformed from private sanctuary into entertainment empire without losing its soul, a building that has been continuously occupied by the same family for nearly 5 centuries, against odds that should have been impossible. To understand how an English nobleman ended up importing African wildlife to save his ancestral home, we need to travel back 4 centuries to 1541, to a very different England, to the England of Henry VIII, when the king's break with Rome was destroying the entire structure of medieval Catholicism and creating opportunities for ruthless men with vision and nerve. This is where our story truly begins, with one such man who saw opportunity in the catastrophe unfolding around him. Sir John Thynne was born around 1515 into a family of minor gentry with ambitions far exceeding their station. His father Thomas Thynne had been nothing remarkable, a country gentleman of modest means, farming land in Shropshire, respectable enough but nowhere near the circles of real power and wealth. But John possessed something his father lacked, an instinct for power, a hunger for advancement, and the patience to cultivate relationships with those who wielded influence. These qualities would transform him from minor gentleman into founder of one of England's great dynasties. In his youth, probably while still in his teens, Thynne attached himself to Edward Seymour, a connection that would prove the foundation of everything that followed. Seymour came from minor West Country gentry like Thynne himself, but he possessed 2 advantages that would change English history. First, he was brother to Jane Seymour, who in 1536 became Henry VIII's 3rd wife after the execution of Anne Boleyn. Second, he was uncle to Prince Edward, born in 1537, the male heir Henry had desperately wanted for years. When Jane Seymour died just days after giving birth, Edward Seymour's position as the young prince's uncle made him one of the most important men in England, and John Thynne was there, attached to Seymour's household, learning the mechanisms of power. Thynne became Seymour's steward, his trusted administrator, the man who managed the vast estates and construction projects that displayed the Duke's power. This was not a decorative position, but one requiring genuine administrative genius. Seymour was accumulating lands across southern England, acquiring former monastic properties, building on a scale that announced his importance. He was constructing Somerset House in London, a magnificent Renaissance palace on the Strand that would become one of the capital's architectural landmarks. Thynne managed all of this, overseeing thousands of workers, coordinating materials from across England and the continent, keeping accounts, negotiating contracts, learning everything about how to build on a monumental scale. Through this role, Thynne learned two crucial skills that would define his life. First, how to manage great wealth, how money flowed through aristocratic households, where profits could be found, how estates could be made to pay for themselves and generate surplus for investment. Second, how to build, the practicalities of construction from foundation to roof, how to work with architects and craftsmen, how to source materials, how to create architecture that would impress and endure. He absorbed lessons in Renaissance design, studied the classical proportions and decorative vocabularies flowing into England from Italy and France, understood how buildings could make statements about their owners' sophistication and power. But Thynne was not content to remain in another man's shadow, however elevated. He was accumulating his own fortune, carefully, methodically, through land purchases, through advantageous appointments to various positions that brought income, through the spoils of the dissolution. When Henry VIII destroyed England's monasteries beginning in 1536, throwing thousands of acres and hundreds of buildings onto the market, men with ready cash and royal connections could acquire properties for fractions of their real value. Thynne was positioned perfectly to profit from this greatest redistribution of land since the Norman conquest. By 1540, Thynne had accumulated enough wealth to think about establishing his own estate, creating a seat that would announce the Thynne family's arrival among the gentry. He needed land with potential, a property he could develop into something magnificent. In that year, an Augustinian priory in Wiltshire came available, one of the hundreds of religious houses Henry VIII was dissolving and selling. It was called Longleat, the name derived from leat, meaning an artificial waterway or channel, referring to the stream that had once supplied the monastery's watermill. The location was magnificent, truly extraordinary. The priory sat in a valley carved over millennia by small streams, surrounded by gentle hills covered in ancient forests, isolated enough for privacy yet accessible enough for visitors travelling from London or Bath. The land was fertile, capable of supporting agriculture and grazing. The hunting was excellent, forests filled with deer and smaller game. The views were spectacular in every direction. In 1541, Thynne had his agent, Sir Charles Appleton, himself a builder of considerable experience, purchase Longleat for £53, a sum so modest it seems impossible today, but which reflected the property's status as dissolved religious house with uncertain title and limited immediate value. The building itself was unremarkable, a collection of monastic structures, dormitories and refectories and chapels, never designed for domestic grandeur or comfort. Medieval monks built for functionality and spiritual contemplation, not for displaying wealth or entertaining guests. But Thynne saw past the existing structures to the potential of the site itself. For 26 years, from 1541 to 1567, Thynne lived in the former monastery while formulating his vision and accumulating the resources to realize it. These were not wasted years, but essential preparation. He continued serving Edward Seymour, who became Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector of England, when the young Edward VI inherited the throne in 1547 at age 9. Thynne's proximity to power brought him additional appointments and income. He accumulated more land around Longleat, buying fields and forests from neighbours, consolidating holdings, creating an estate worthy of supporting a great house. He studied architecture obsessively, corresponding with master craftsmen, visiting great houses being built across England as Renaissance ideas flooded in from the continent, absorbing lessons he would apply to his own project. He also survived political catastrophe that might have destroyed him. In 1549, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, fell from power, arrested and imprisoned by rivals. Thynne, as Somerset's steward and close associate, might have been swept away in his patron's fall. But Thynne demonstrated political agility, distancing himself enough to avoid serious consequences while maintaining some connection to Somerset. When Somerset was executed in 1552, Thynne survived with his fortune and freedom intact, a remarkable achievement that speaks to his skill at navigating treacherous waters. By the 1560s, Thynne was approaching 50 years old, wealthy beyond his father's dreams, established in Wiltshire society, ready to create his masterpiece. He had been thinking about Longleat for over 2 decades, refining his vision, planning every detail, and in April 1567, fate forced his hand in the most dramatic way possible. fire swept through Longleat Priory on a spring night, flames consuming the old monastic buildings, destroying everything that remained of the medieval structure. Contemporary accounts describe a conflagration visible for miles, sparks rising into the night sky, timber frames collapsing in cascades of embers. By morning, nothing remained but smoking ruins. The catastrophe that might have devastated another man instead liberated Thynne. Now he had no choice but to rebuild, and rebuilding meant he could construct exactly what he had been imagining for decades. He was 62 years old, an extraordinary age for the 16th century when life expectancy for even wealthy men was perhaps 50 years. Most men his age would have accepted defeat, perhaps built a modest manor house and lived out their remaining years quietly. But Thynne had not spent 26 years planning to settle for modest. He would build the greatest house in England, or die trying. Construction began immediately in 1567, under conditions that were extraordinarily complex, even by the standards of great Elizabethan building projects. This would be no mere country house, but an architectural manifesto, a declaration of wealth and taste and modernity that would announce the Thynne family's arrival among England's elite. The project Thynne envisioned would require resources on a scale rarely attempted by anyone below royal rank. To create it, Thynne assembled a team unprecedented in English building, drawing on expertise from across the kingdom and beyond. Sir Charles Appleton, the man who had purchased Longleat for Thynne back in 1541, brought his experience from Somerset House and other major projects. He understood the logistics of large construction sites, how to coordinate hundreds of workers, how to ensure materials arrived when needed. Adrian Gaunt contributed his mastery of stonework, the technical knowledge of how to cut and dress and lay stone in ways that would endure for centuries. Alan Maynard added his expertise in fine craftsmanship, the decorative elements that would elevate Longleat from mere building to work of art. Humphrey Lovell brought his understanding of engineering, of structural systems and roof construction, and all the technical challenges involved in creating a building this ambitious. The Earl of Hertford, one of the most powerful nobles in England, provided aristocratic advice, helping Thynne understand what a house at this level needed to include, what rooms and features would be expected by visitors of the highest rank. And then there was Robert Smithson, the most celebrated architect of the Elizabethan age, the genius who would go on to design Wallerton Hall in Nottinghamshire and Hardwicke Hall in Derbyshire, two of the most important buildings in English architectural history. Smithson's exact role at Longleat is debated by historians because the documentation is incomplete, but his influence on the design is unmistakable to anyone familiar with his other works. The emphasis on symmetry, the innovative use of glass, the fusion of English and continental styles all bear Smithson's signature. Whether he was the primary designer or a consulting expert brought in for specific elements, his contribution was significant. But the controlling intelligence, the guiding vision, the final authority on every decision was Sir John Thynne himself. This was his obsession, his life's work, his bid for immortality. He supervised every detail personally, living on site, watching construction progress, making this one of the first examples in England of an architectural patron who was also the effective architect. The division between patron and architect that we take for granted today, where the architect designs and the client approves, did not exist in the same way in Elizabethan England. Great houses were collaborative efforts, and Thynne was determined to be the primary collaborator. The style Thynne chose was revolutionary for England, genuinely unprecedented in its ambition and execution. Longleat would be what architectural historians now call a prodigy house, that uniquely Elizabethan building type that emerged in the second half of the 16th century, combining English perpendicular Gothic traditions with Renaissance classicism imported from France and Italy. These buildings were called prodigy houses because they were prodigies, marvels, buildings that seemed to exceed what should be possible. They were not quite medieval castles and not quite Italian palazzos, but something new, something distinctly English, even while drawing on continental inspiration. The result was architectural fusion that had never existed before, a synthesis of medieval English verticality with continental horizontality, of Gothic drama with classical restraint, of English materials and building traditions with Renaissance proportions and decorative vocabularies. Longleat would rise tall like an English church, but spread horizontally like an Italian palazzo. It would have the symmetry and regularity that Renaissance theory demanded, but executed in honey-coloured bathstone rather than Italian marble. It would have enormous windows filling the facades with glass, creating light-filled interiors impossible in defensive medieval buildings, announcing that this was a house for a peaceful age, a house that need not fear attack. The construction process consumed 13 years from 1567 to 1580, an extraordinarily long period that reflected both the ambition of the design and the perfectionism of its creator. For context, most country houses of the period took 5 to 7 years to complete. Longleat took nearly twice that, not because of delays or incompetence, but because Thynne insisted on getting every detail exactly right. He had waited 26 years to build his masterpiece, and he was not going to rush the final realization. The workforce was massive, numbering in the hundreds at peak periods, perhaps as many as 200 to 300 men working simultaneously at the height of construction. This small army included specialists in dozens of trades, each requiring years of training, each bringing essential skills. Stonemasons came from across England, many trained in the Gothic traditions of church building, men who had learned their trade cutting stone for cathedral repairs or monastic construction before the dissolution. Now they adapted their skills to Renaissance requirements, cutting classical mouldings and cornices, creating symmetrical facades, executing designs that would have been foreign to their medieval predecessors. The masons organized themselves into hierarchies based on skill. Master masons directed the work, interpreting designs, ensuring stones fit together properly, checking measurements constantly. Journeyman masons did the bulk of the cutting, shaping rough blocks into precise pieces. Apprentices did the simplest work, learning the trade while hauling materials and preparing mortar. The stone dust that covered them all was the mark of their profession, visible on their clothes and skin and in their lungs. Carpenters were equally numerous and specialized. Master carpenters designed the complex timber roof structures, the frames that would support thousands of tons of stone and slate, the internal floor joists spanning rooms, the intricate paneling that would cover walls. These men worked in oak, that English wood that could last centuries if properly seasoned and installed. They created frames using traditional joinery, mortise and tenon joints secured with wooden pegs, connections that could survive for ages without metal fasteners. Finnish carpenters created the decorative elements, carved paneling and door surrounds and window frames, executing Renaissance designs in English oak. Glaziers faced perhaps the most challenging technical task. The windows Thynne demanded were enormous by any standard, vast expanses of glass held in delicate stone mullions and transoms, filling entire walls with transparent panes. Glass in the 1570s was still made by hand, blown into cylinders, then cut and flattened into sheets, a process that limited pane size and created inevitable imperfections. Each window required dozens or even hundreds of individual panes, carefully cut and fitted, sealed with lead cames, the joints waterproofed with putty. The amount of glass in Longleat was unprecedented, requiring glaziers to work for years creating and installing windows. Plumbers, working in lead rather than the iron or copper we associate with plumbing today, created the roofing that would protect the entire structure. Lead was ideal for roofing because it could be formed into sheets that were both flexible and durable, that could be shaped around complex roof geometries that would last for centuries. But lead was expensive and heavy, requiring sophisticated structural support. The plumbers at Longleat installed thousands of square feet of lead sheeting, joining sheets with soldered seams, creating a weatherproof barrier that has protected the house for over 400 years. Plasterers created the elaborate ceilings, working with lime plaster to form decorative surfaces. They built up layers, creating flat surfaces or moulded designs, sometimes incorporating ribs and bosses in geometric patterns, sometimes leaving smooth expanses for later painting. The ceiling work was among the last tasks, done after the roof was complete and the interior dry, requiring scaffolding that filled entire rooms. Beyond these primary trades, dozens of other specialists contributed. Blacksmiths forged iron hinges and locks and decorative elements. Tilers created floors in service areas. Painters decorated surfaces, applying pigments mixed from minerals and oils. Labourers did the back-breaking work of moving materials, mixing mortar, hauling stone and timber, digging foundations, tasks that required strong backs rather than specialised skills, but were equally essential to the project's success. The materials came from across England and beyond, requiring supply chains that stretched hundreds of miles. The primary building stone was Bath stone, that beautiful honey-coloured limestone quarried in Somerset, about 20 miles from Longleat. Bath stone was ideal for prestigious buildings because it cut easily when freshly quarried but hardened with exposure to air, because its fine grain allowed detailed carving, because its warm colour glowed golden in sunlight. But extracting and transporting Bath stone required enormous effort. Quarrymen used wedges and crowbars to split stone from the quarry face, a process that required understanding the stone's natural bedding planes to avoid creating unusable pieces. Each block might weigh hundreds of pounds or even tons depending on its purpose. Transportation from quarry to building site was its own challenge. The roads of Elizabethan England were terrible by modern standards, rutted tracks that turned to mud in rain, barely passable for wheeled vehicles. Stone travelled by wagon when possible, each wagon carrying perhaps half a ton pulled by teams of oxen, covering maybe 10 miles a day under good conditions. When roads were impassable, stone might be transported by pack-horse, single blocks loaded onto specially designed saddles. Some stone probably travelled by water when possible, loaded onto barges on the River Avon, then transferred to wagons for the final miles to Longleat. Thousands upon thousands of tons of stone made this journey over 13 years, an almost unimaginable logistical achievement. Oak timbers for the structural frames and floors came from Longleat's own extensive woodlands and from neighbouring estates. These were not young trees, but ancient oaks, perhaps 200 or 300 years old, 60 or 80 feet tall, their trunks 3 or 4 feet in diameter. Felling such trees required teams of woodsmen working with axes and two-man saws, cutting notches, controlling the fall direction, sectioning the trunk once down. The trunks were dragged from forests by oxen, taken to saw pits where teams of 2 men, one standing atop the timber and one in a pit below, used long saws to cut trunks into beams. This was exhausting, dangerous work, requiring strength and skill and endurance. The oak had to be seasoned, allowed to dry for months or years before use to prevent warping and cracking. Thin must have been stockpiling timber for years before construction began, felling trees and storing them, building the reserve of materials the project would require. The amount of oak in Longleat is staggering when you consider it. Thousands of beams and joists and rafters, floors for dozens of rooms, roof structures spanning the entire building, panelling covering walls, all created from trees that were already ancient when Henry VIII was king. Lead for the roofing required its own supply chain, mined in the Mendip Hills south of Bath and transported to site in ingots. Lead mining in the 16th century was dangerous work, miners descending into galleries following veins of ore, working in darkness lit only by candles, facing constant risk of collapse or flooding. The ore was smelted on site, using wood or charcoal fires, producing lead ingots that were transported to Longleat and converted into roofing sheets. The amount of lead on Longleat's roof probably totalled hundreds of tons, representing thousands of hours of mining and smelting labour. Glass for the windows came from glassmakers in England and possibly the continent. The technology for making large panes did not yet exist, so each window consisted of dozens of small panes held together with lead cames, the dark lines you see in surviving Elizabethan windows. The glass itself was not perfectly clear like modern glass, but slightly wavy, containing small bubbles and imperfections, creating a subtle distortion when you looked through it that actually added to its charm. The cost of glass was enormous, as much as or more than the stonework, making Longleat's extensive glazing a display of wealth as much as an architectural choice. Lime for mortar and plaster was produced by burning limestone in kilns, a process that required constant tending and created choking clouds of caustic dust. The lime was slaked by adding water, creating a putty that was mixed with sand to make mortar or used pure for fine plaster. Enormous quantities were needed, perhaps hundreds of tons over the course of construction. The total workforce at any given time probably numbered between 200 and 300 men, a small army dedicated to one man's vision. They lived in temporary housing on site or in nearby villages, working dawn to dusk during good weather, idled by rain or winter cold. The casualties must have been significant, though no records survive. Construction in this era was dangerous. Men fell from scaffolding, were crushed by falling stones, suffered injuries from tools and machinery, died from accidents that are unrecorded. The human cost of creating Longleat is invisible, but was certainly real. The building that emerged from this 13-year effort of hundreds of men and vast resources was unlike anything England had seen before. Longleat House measures approximately 260 feet along its main facade, an immense horizontal mass that announces its presence in the landscape. For comparison, most country houses of the period measured perhaps 100 to 150 feet across. Longleat is nearly twice that, creating a scale that approaches palace rather than house. The facade is broken by 3-story projecting bays that create a rhythmic pattern of light and shadow, advancing and receding in a way that adds visual interest and breaks up what could have been monotonous length. These bays are symmetrically arranged, creating the regularity that Renaissance theory demanded, but executed with an English sense of drama and height. But it is the vertical emphasis that makes the design extraordinary and distinctly English despite its classical influences. Longleat rises 3 full stories above ground level, each story clearly defined by horizontal string courses that circle the entire building. But unlike Italian palazzos where the floors are equally sized, Longleat's stories increase in height as you ascend, creating a sense of rising toward the sky that echoes English perpendicular Gothic church towers. Above the 3rd floor are attic levels and service spaces, and crowning everything is a flat roof platform with balustrades, creating outdoor terraces accessible from the attic level. The building forms an elongated rectangle in plan, organized around internal courtyards that no longer exist in their original form. This arrangement maximized window exposure, ensuring that every major room had exterior walls with windows, creating maximum light and air circulation. The courtyards also provided service access, allowing servants to move supplies and waste without entering the principal rooms. The overall plan reflects both practical requirements and aesthetic ambitions, creating a house that worked efficiently while displaying magnificently. But the defining characteristic of Longleat, the feature that contemporaries found most astonishing, and that makes the house instantly recognizable even today, is glass. Longleat has more window than wall, vast expanses of glazing held in delicate stone mullions and transoms creating glittering facades visible for miles across the Wiltshire countryside. This was revolutionary, genuinely shocking in 1580 when glass remained expensive, and houses were typically dark and fortress-like, with small windows designed more for defence than illumination. Thynne was making multiple statements with this unprecedented glazing. First, a statement about wealth, because glass was expensive, and these enormous windows announced that he could afford costs that would bankrupt lesser men. Second, a statement about modernity, because this architectural transparency represented the newest continental ideas, the Renaissance philosophy that buildings should bring the outside world inside rather than shutting it out. Third, a statement about confidence in a peaceful future, because a house this open, this vulnerable, could never be defended. Medieval castles had narrow windows that could be shuttered against arrows. Longleat's windows announced that such defensive concerns were obsolete, that England under Elizabeth I was stable and secure enough that even the wealthiest needed no fortification. The windows rise floor to ceiling in the principal rooms, often 15 or 20 feet tall, creating walls of glass divided into hundreds of small panes by stone mullions and transoms forming geometric grids. The effect was and is spectacular, flooding interiors with natural light, offering occupants unprecedented views of the landscape capability Brown would later perfect, creating rooms that feel connected to the world outside in ways medieval buildings never achieved. The glass catches sunlight and glows, makes the entire building shimmer and sparkle, creates a beacon visible across the countryside, announcing that here lives someone important, someone who commands resources beyond normal comprehension. Contemporary visitors describe Longleat as appearing to be made more of glass than of stone, a glittering jewel set in green hills. The effect was intentional and theatrical, architecture as performance, a building designed to impress and intimidate and inspire awe. Thynne wanted everyone who saw Longleat to understand immediately that they were dealing with someone who operated on a different level, someone who had transcended the limitations ordinary people faced. The exterior stone walls rise directly from the ground without basements or extensive foundations visible above grade, a risky choice for such a massive structure, but one that allowed Thynne to position the house at the valley bottom, where it could dominate views from every approach rather than placing it defensively on high ground. The walls are constructed of carefully dressed Bath stone blocks, each cut to precise dimensions, laid in regular courses with thin mortar joints, creating surfaces of almost mathematical precision. At regular intervals, the walls are punctuated by the projecting bays, by entrance porticos, by decorative elements that break up the surfaces and create visual interest. The roofline is flat with balustrades running the entire perimeter, punctured by decorative chimneys that rise in classical proportions rather than the clustered medieval stacks typical of English buildings. These chimneys are themselves architectural features, designed with bases and shafts and caps, treated as sculptural elements rather than mere functional necessities. The flat roof with its balustrade was an Italian feature, referencing the palazzo architecture Thynne admired, but executed in English materials and at English scale. This combination of massive scale, horizontal organization, vertical emphasis, and overwhelming glazing created what we now recognize as the Elizabethan Prodigy house style, a building type that would influence English architecture for generations. Longleat established templates that later buildings like Wollaton Hall and Hardwicke Hall would develop further, creating an architectural language that was distinctly English, even while drawing on continental sources. This was architecture that announced England's emergence as a major European power, confident enough to borrow from Italian and French precedents, but creative enough to transform those influences into something new. Step through the main entrance of Longleat today, and you enter the Great Hall, the heart of the house, and the space that most directly recalls its Elizabethan origins, while also reflecting 4 centuries of modifications and additions. This is not the cavernous medieval hall open to the rafters, dark and smoky from central hearths, where the entire household gathered for meals and entertainment. Rather, this is a Renaissance interpretation of that tradition, a space that maintains symbolic importance while adapting to new ideas about comfort and hierarchy. The ceiling is plastered and decorated rather than exposing roof timbers, held at a reasonable height that maintains human scale while suggesting grandeur. The plaster is formed into geometric patterns, perhaps with pendant bosses or ribs creating divisions, painted in colours that would have been vivid when new but have mellowed over centuries to subtle earth tones. A minstrel's gallery overlooks the space from one end, a balcony where musicians could play during entertainments, their music filling the hall while they remained visually separate, servants providing ambience for their social superiors. The walls display arms and armour, portrait paintings, heraldic symbols, all the visual markers of aristocratic continuity and military service that great families accumulated over centuries. Suits of armour stand in corners or hang on walls, helmets and breastplates and weapons polished to mirror brightness, representing ancestors who served crown and country in various wars. Portrait paintings show generations of Thynnes in their finest dress, men in doublets and ruffs and later in wigs and coats, women in elaborate gowns that document changing fashions across 400 years. Heraldic shields display the family arms, the symbolic vocabulary of lineage and alliances that aristocrats use to situate themselves within complex social networks. The floor is stone, likely the same Bath stone as the walls, cut into large paving slabs worn smooth by 4 centuries of footsteps. The wear patterns themselves tell stories, visible paths, showing where people most commonly walked, where tables stood, where doors opened. In Elizabethan times, the hall would have had rushes scattered on the floor, replaced periodically, providing some insulation and absorbing spills. Later generations installed the permanent stone paving we see today, easier to maintain and more elegant. From the Great Hall you enter the Lower East Corridor, originally designed as servant circulation space, one of those practical features that make great houses function. Servants needed to move between rooms carrying meals, coal for fires, water for washing, messages and packages, all without disturbing family and guests occupying the principal chambers. The corridor system allowed this circulation, passages parallel to the main rooms where staff could scurry unseen, maintaining the illusion that aristocratic life proceeded without effort or labour. Today, this wide passage has been transformed into a gallery displaying fine furniture and paintings accumulated by generations of Thins. Cabinets and chairs and tables line the walls, pieces from the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries showing the evolution of English furniture, making from heavy oak joinery to elegant mahogany and walnut pieces with marquetry and gilding. Paintings hang above, landscapes and portraits and still lifes, some by recognised masters and others by skilled craftsmen, all part of the visual wealth that distinguished great houses. Two massive visitor books rest on stands, open to specific pages chosen for their historical importance. One shows the signatures of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, their distinctive hands signing their names during a visit, acknowledgement that even in the 20th century British royalty came to Longleat as guests, that the Thins remained socially significant enough to receive such honours. The other book displays the signatures of King George VI when he was Duke of York, and his wife Elizabeth, who would become the beloved Queen Mother, their visit dating to before George's unexpected accession to the throne in 1936. These signatures represent moments when the British monarchy literally touched Longleat, ink on paper recording royal presence, validation that the status Sir John Thynne dreamed of in the 1540s had been achieved and maintained across centuries. The ante-library announces itself with a magnificent Venetian ceiling painting, Baroque exuberance exploding across plaster in colours that seem too vivid for restrained England. Reds and golds and blues swirl in allegorical scenes. Muscular male figures representing virtues or gods or heroes. Voluptuous female figures embodying abstract concepts or classical myths, all painted with the dramatic foreshortening and theatrical lighting that Venetian artists perfected in the 17th and 18th centuries. This ceiling was not original to the house, but added later, probably in the 18th century when the first Marquess of Bath was modernising and embellishing, bringing Italian sophistication to his Elizabethan inheritance. The painting would have been done on canvas in Venice by skilled artists, then shipped to England rolled in tubes, stretched onto frames and installed on the ceiling, architectural decoration as import trade. This room serves as prelude and preparation for the Red Library beyond, creating anticipation, suggesting the intellectual treasures ahead. The name ante-library means exactly what it suggests, the room before the library, an architectural build-up to the main event. This progressive revelation, moving from space to space with each building on the previous one, is characteristic of great house design, the choreography of experience that controls how visitors encounter the building. The Red Library hits you like a physical presence when you enter, walls lined floor to ceiling with books, 40,000 volumes or more depending on how you count, one of the great private libraries in England. The Thynne family took scholarship seriously, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries when collecting books became both intellectual pursuit and status symbol. The Red Library represents the heart of that tradition, centuries of accumulation reflecting family interests, and the evolution of English intellectual life. The books line walls in custom-built shelving, mahogany or walnut bookcases with adjustable shelves, glass doors protecting the most valuable volumes, leather bindings in browns and reds and greens creating a tapestry of knowledge. Some are bound in full leather, spines stamped with gold titles and decorative tools. Others are half-bound, leather spines with marbled paper covering boards, less expensive but still elegant. A few are in original publishers' bindings, cloth or boards depending on date, showing how books were sold before custom binding became universal for wealthy collectors. The collection includes first editions of important works, rare manuscripts, incunabula printed before 1500, beautiful illustrated volumes, and simply well-read books bought because family members wanted to read them. There are classical texts in Latin and Greek, testament to the humanist education aristocrats received. There are works of philosophy and theology, of history and biography, of science and mathematics, of poetry and drama, representing 4 centuries of English and European intellectual production. Some books show signs of heavy use, margins filled with annotations, pages worn soft from repeated reading. Others appear unread, bought to complete sets or because fashion demanded ownership, spines intact and pages pristine. The room itself is designed to accommodate this collection, with rolling library ladders to reach upper shelves, reading tables with good natural light from tall windows, comfortable chairs for extended reading. This was a working library, not just display, a room where family members actually read and studied, where tutors instructed children, where the life of the mind was pursued seriously. The Red Library represents the Thin's claim to be not just wealthy but cultured, not just powerful but educated, not just aristocrats but intellectuals. The breakfast room echoes the ante-library with its own spectacular painted ceiling, creating a sense of progression and variety as you move through the house, each room offering new visual experiences while maintaining overall architectural coherence. These elaborately painted ceilings represent later additions to the original Elizabethan structure, evidence that each generation of Thins felt compelled to update and embellish their inheritance, adding their own mark to what they received. The 18th and 19th centuries in particular saw extensive interior decoration programs as families brought continental sophistication to English houses, hiring skilled artists to create surfaces that would impress visitors and display family cultivation. The lower dining room suggests the scale at which the family regularly entertained even when not hosting formal state occasions. This is a room designed for perhaps 20 or 30 guests, large enough to be impressive but small enough to maintain conversational intimacy. The table would be set with silver and crystal and fine china, multiple courses served by footmen, wines carefully chosen to complement each dish, conversations ranging across politics and literature and society gossip, all the social currency that bound the aristocracy together. One of the most fascinating spaces for modern visitors is the bath bedroom, where an enormous lead-lined wooden tub stands as testament to changing standards of hygiene and comfort across centuries. This bathtub is a work of cooperage, constructed like a barrel with wooden staves held together by metal bands, a technique usually applied to making containers for storing liquids, but here adapted to create a container for sitting in liquids. The wood is probably oak, chosen for its durability and water resistance, carefully shaped and fitted so the staves create a watertight vessel when properly assembled. The interior is lined with lead to ensure complete waterproofing and to prevent the wood from absorbing water and rotting. Lead lining was standard for high-quality baths in this period because lead was malleable enough to be formed into complex shapes, durable enough to last decades, and genuinely waterproof in ways wood alone could never be. The lead sheets were carefully fitted and soldered together, creating a smooth surface that could be easily cleaned and that would last essentially forever, if not abused. Originally, this tub was filled by hand in a process that required hours of servant labour and careful planning. Fires in basement or ground floor kitchens would heat water in enormous copper kettles, 10 or 20 gallons at a time. Servants would carry these kettles, each weighing perhaps 80 to 100 pounds when full, upstairs to the bathroom, a journey that required strength and balance and care to avoid scalds. Each trip brought maybe 10 gallons, and filling this tub to a comfortable depth for bathing probably required 100 gallons or more, meaning 10 trips minimum, probably more like 15 or 20 if the water was kept hot, by mixing boiling water with cooler water to reach comfortable temperature. Draining was equally laborious. Servants would bale the used bath water out bucket by bucket, carrying it back downstairs to empty in drains or gardens, another hour or more of backbreaking work. The entire process of preparing a bath, from starting the fires to heating water, to filling the tub to draining it after use, could consume half a day of multiple servants' time. This was why bathing remained relatively infrequent even among the wealthy, not because they didn't value cleanliness, but because the practical requirements were so demanding. Later generations added taps and drains, connecting the bath to more modern plumbing systems. Pipes brought water directly to the tub from cisterns or early pressurized systems, reducing filling time from hours to minutes. Drains carried used water away to septic systems or sewers, eliminating the need for bucket brigades. In 2005, the lead lining was replaced during conservation work, the old lead having finally deteriorated after perhaps 2 or 3 centuries of service, proof that even the best materials eventually require renewal. Adjacent to the bath stands the house's first plumbed-in flush toilet, a Victorian innovation that seemed miraculous in its time, and that we now take completely for granted. This toilet connects to water supply and drainage systems, creating genuine modern sanitation, replacing the chamber pots and close stools that had served for centuries. Chamber pots were ceramic containers kept in bedrooms for nighttime use, emptied by servants every morning, the contents carried in covered buckets to outdoor privies or cesspits. Close stools were wooden boxes with holes in the top, chamber pots concealed inside, sometimes cushioned and sometimes even heated for winter comfort, the height of luxury in their time but primitive by modern standards. The arrival of flush toilets and modern plumbing in the late 19th century represented a genuine revolution in domestic comfort and hygiene. Suddenly, the wealthy could enjoy cleanliness and convenience impossible for previous generations. These innovations spread gradually through houses like Longleat, with the most important rooms receiving modern amenities first, and less critical spaces updated over time. The survival of this early flush toilet in its original location allows modern visitors to see evidence of this transformation, to understand that even the richest families lived without what we consider basic necessities until shockingly recently. These fixtures remind us that we should not romanticize aristocratic life in previous centuries. Yes, families like the Thinns lived in beautiful houses, filled with artwork and fine furnishings. Yes, they employed dozens of servants and could command resources far beyond what ordinary people dreamed of. But they also lived without heating beyond fireplaces, without electric light, without refrigeration, without easy bathing, without modern sanitation, suffering from cold and darkness and discomfort that we would find intolerable. The past really was different, and not always in ways that inspire nostalgia. The state dining room represents 19th century additions and updates, created during the Victorian era when entertaining reached peak formality and complexity. This room was designed for formal dinners, the occasions when the family needed to display their status and wealth most explicitly. The table could seat perhaps 40 or 50 guests depending on arrangement, an enormous mahogany surface that could be extended with leaves to accommodate varying numbers. The table settings would be spectacular, multiple forks and knives and spoons for each guest, different utensils for different courses, placement dictated by rigid etiquette that everyone of breeding understood instinctively. The centerpiece is a magnificent work of Meissen porcelain, probably a large sculptural arrangement featuring flowers or figures or both, created by craftsmen at the famous German porcelain factory that became synonymous with luxury ceramic production. Meissen porcelain in the 18th and 19th centuries was extraordinarily expensive, its whiteness and translucency and decorative possibilities far exceeding any other European ceramic production. Owning significant pieces announced taste and wealth, displayed knowledge of continental sophistication, situated owners among the international aristocracy who shared aesthetic vocabularies transcending national boundaries. The room itself would be decorated with appropriate grandeur. Walls might be covered in damask silk or elaborate wallpaper, in colours chosen to complement the dining experience, perhaps deep reds or rich golds, colours associated with appetite and warmth. The ceiling would display elaborate plasterwork or painting. Chandeliers would hang overhead, originally holding dozens of candles, later converted to gas and eventually electricity, providing dramatic illumination that made crystal sparkle and silver glow. Sideboards would line the walls laden with additional silver serving pieces, decorative items, perhaps floral arrangements in massive vases, all creating an atmosphere of almost overwhelming richness. Formal dinners in this room proceeded according to strict protocols. Guests assembled in another room first, perhaps the saloon, for drinks and conversation before dinner was announced. They would then process to the dining room in hierarchical order, the highest-ranking male guest escorting the hostess, the highest-ranking female guest escorted by the host, others paired according to complex rules of precedence that took into account title, age, relationship to hosts, and other factors. Seating at table was equally choreographed, with place cards directing guests to their assigned positions. The meal itself might include 8 or 10 or even more courses, each brought from kitchens by footmen, served from the left, removed from the right, following service protocols that required years to learn properly. The courses progressed in established sequence, perhaps soup, then fish, then entree, then roast, then game, then savoury, then sweets, then fruit and nuts, each accompanied by appropriate wines carefully chosen to enhance flavours. Conversation flowed according to rules. Guests expected to talk first to the person on their right, then switch to the person on their left between courses, ensuring everyone participated in multiple conversations over the course of the meal. The entire dinner might last 3 or 4 hours, an endurance test disguised as pleasure, display of wealth and sophistication consuming enormous resources, not just in food and wine, but in servant labour, in silver and crystal and china, in the very time expended. After dinner, ladies and gentlemen would separate, women retiring to a drawing room for coffee, while men remained at table for port and cigars, discussing politics and business in ways considered inappropriate for female ears. Eventually the groups would reunite for further socializing before guests departed or retired to assigned bedrooms if staying overnight. The saloon and state drawing room, designed by John Crace in Italian Renaissance Revival style, display the Victorian taste for historical pastiche, for recreating or evoking the architecture of previous eras through decorative programs that combine genuine scholarship with theatrical effect. Crace had worked on Brighton Pavilion for George IV, creating those extraordinary Orientalist interiors that transformed a seaside house into an Indian fantasy. He had worked on Chatsworth House, one of England's greatest ducal palaces. He had worked on the Palace of Westminster after the old Parliament buildings burned, contributing to the Gothic Revival interiors that defined Victorian public architecture. Bringing this same talent to Longleat, he created spaces of overwhelming visual richness. The walls are covered in gilded moulding, intricate patterns that divide surfaces into panels and frames, creating architectural order through applied decoration. Paint covers every surface in colours more vivid than restrained English taste typically allowed, reds and blues and golds competing for attention, creating rooms that feel more Mediterranean than British. The ceilings explode with decoration, elaborate paintings or sculptural plasterwork or both, drawing the eye upward, creating three-dimensional effects through perspective illusions and relief modelling. Furniture in these rooms matches the decorative intensity, gilded chairs upholstered in silk or velvet, tables with marble or inlaid tops, cabinets displaying porcelain or silver collections, mirrors in elaborate frames reflecting and multiplying the visual complexity. The effect is almost overwhelming to modern sensibilities used to minimalism and restraint, but Victorians loved this kind of richness, saw it as appropriate to aristocratic status, understood these rooms as stages for social performance, where family members played their parts in the drama of class and privilege. The Chinese bedroom reflects the Victorian fascination with Orientalism, that complex cultural phenomenon where Europeans imagined and recreated Asian aesthetics through their own cultural filters, creating rooms that were neither genuinely Chinese nor conventionally Western, but something hybrid and strange. The walls are covered in hand-painted Chinese wallpaper, or European imitations depicting exotic birds and flowers and landscapes, imagery drawn from Chinese artistic traditions but executed for Western tastes. These wallpapers were expensive luxuries, either genuine Chinese export wallpaper hand-painted in Canton and shipped around the world, or European imitations created by skilled craftsmen studying Chinese examples and adapting techniques. The colours were typically brilliant, blues and greens and reds applied in mineral and vegetable pigments that achieved intensities difficult to match in Western traditions. The compositions showed natural scenes, gardens and bamboo groves, pavilions and bridges, birds perched on branches, all creating exotic atmospheres that transported viewers to imagined Chinas that bore limited resemblance to the real country. The music room holds instruments that represent domestic entertainment before recorded sound transformed how people experience music. A barrel organ stands perhaps as the room's centerpiece, a mechanical instrument where a rotating cylinder studded with pins plays tunes automatically when the mechanism is turned, creating music without requiring a trained player. These devices were popular in the 18th and 19th centuries for providing music in domestic settings, particularly for dancing, offering consistent tempo and familiar melodies. There might also be a piano, perhaps a grand piano with its elegant curves and imposing presence, representing the pinnacle of domestic keyboard instruments. Piano playing was an essential accomplishment for upper-class women in the 19th century, and most great houses had one or more instruments. There might be music stands for chamber music performances, cabinets holding sheet music, perhaps other instruments like violins or cellos, all the tools needed to create the entertainment that filled evenings before television and radio, and recorded music provided effortless access to professional performances. The music room represents the importance of amateur music making in aristocratic life. Families and guests gathered for informal concerts, taking turns performing, accompanying each other, creating entertainment that required genuine skill and practice. This was not background music, but focused activity demanding attention and appreciation. The ability to play competently, to sing pleasingly, to understand musical forms and composers, all marked cultivation and refinement, separated the educated from the ignorant, created social bonds through shared aesthetic experience. The Prince of Wales' bedroom takes its name from a large portrait of Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, the elder brother of Charles the Third, who died young in 1612 at age 18, cutting short a life that might have changed English history dramatically. Henry Frederick was everything his younger brother Charles was not, tall and athletic and charismatic, where Charles was short and stammering and socially awkward, Protestant and militarily ambitious, where Charles would prove too accommodating to Catholic influences, and insufficiently supportive of anti-Spanish foreign policy. Had Henry Frederick lived to inherit the throne, the conflicts that exploded into civil war under Charles I might never have occurred, or might have taken very different forms. His portrait hanging here in this bedroom reminds visitors that the Thyns moved in royal circles from the beginning, that princes and kings knew Longleat and visited as guests, that the family Sir John Thynne founded achieved precisely the social elevation he dreamed of. The portrait itself is likely a good copy of an original by a court painter, showing the young prince in armour or court dress, handsome and vigorous, representing the doomed promise of what might have been. The grand staircase, a Victorian replacement for Christopher Wren's original 17th century design, rises in dramatic curves from the ground floor through multiple levels, the kind of theatrical architectural space designed for entrances and exits and pauses, for seeing and being seen. Staircases in great houses were never purely functional, but always performative, stages where family members and guests made entrances, where processions formed for dinners or balls, where young ladies in their finest dresses descended to dazzle assembled company below. This staircase is probably stone or wood depending on construction, with elaborate balustrades in carved wood or wrought iron, the materials chosen to convey appropriate grandeur. The walls rising alongside are decorated with paintings or architectural elements, perhaps niches holding sculptures, creating visual interest for those ascending or descending. Windows at landings provide natural light and views of the grounds, momentary pauses in the vertical journey, allowing appreciation of both interior architecture and exterior landscape. The decision to remove Wren's original staircase and replace it with this Victorian version represents the sometimes problematic nature of architectural evolution in houses like Longleat. Wren was one of England's greatest architects, and his staircase was undoubtedly a masterpiece of its kind. But Victorian taste found it inadequate, perhaps too restrained, perhaps not grand enough for modern requirements, perhaps simply old-fashioned. So it was demolished and replaced with this larger, more dramatic structure. From a preservation standpoint, this seems tragic, the loss of an irreplaceable Wren design, but from the perspective of the family living in Longleat, they were simply updating their house to meet contemporary standards, doing exactly what their ancestors had always done. And on the top floor, in spaces that once housed servants' quarters under the roof, the current Marquess has created a banqueting suite with contemporary design, proving that Longleat's architectural evolution continues into the 21st century. The interiors are by Claire Rendall, a designer known for sophisticated contemporary work that respects historical context while asserting modern aesthetics. The furniture includes pieces by John Makepeace, one of Britain's greatest living craftsmen, whose work in wood combines traditional materials with innovative forms and impeccable construction. The chandelier is by Jocelyn Burton, an artist working in metal and glass to create lighting sculptures that are functional objects and artwork simultaneously. This banqueting suite represents the latest chapter in Longleat's continuing evolution, demonstrating that the house remains a living place where each generation adds its mark while respecting what came before. The contemporary design does not attempt to imitate historical styles, but instead creates dialogue between past and present, between the Elizabethan and Victorian and 21st century layers, showing that architectural heritage can accommodate innovation without betraying its essential character. This willingness to continue evolving, to remain contemporary while honouring history, may be one reason Longleat has survived when so many other great houses have become frozen museums or been demolished entirely. But architecture means nothing without life, and Longleat came alive under Sir John Thynne's occupation, beginning in 1580, when construction was substantially complete, though detail work continued for some years. Sir John was 65 years old when he finally moved into his masterpiece, having spent literally his entire adult life planning and building this monument to family ambition. He lived in Longleat with his wife Christian Gresham, his children and grandchildren who represented the dynasty he had established, the future he had secured through decades of calculation and effort. The house required a staff of dozens, probably 50 or more servants in various roles, creating a complex society within the building. A steward managed the household, overseeing all other staff, handling accounts, ensuring everything ran smoothly, answering directly to Sir John. An estate manager handled the vast lands surrounding the house, the farms and forests that provided income and supplies, collecting rents from tenant farmers, coordinating agricultural production, managing timber harvesting and gamekeeping. Cooks and kitchen staff worked in basement kitchens preparing meals, complicated work requiring genuine skill and years of training, coordinating multiple dishes that needed to be ready simultaneously, managing fires and ovens, preparing food for family and for staff, which were separate operations with different standards. Chambermaids cleaned the endless rooms, a labour of Sisyphus that never ended, because as soon as one cycle of cleaning was complete, it was time to start again. They lit fires every morning in fireplaces throughout the house, carrying coal or wood up from storage, removing ashes from the previous day, scrubbing grates, a dirty, exhausting task that began before dawn. They made beds, changed linens, dusted furniture, swept floors, polished silver and brass, washed windows, maintained the spotless perfection that aristocratic life required. Footmen served at table, standing behind chairs during meals ready to serve or clear dishes, to pour wine, to attend to any need. They attended to gentlemen guests, helping with coats and boots, delivering messages, carrying luggage, performing all the personal services that maintain the fiction that aristocrats lived lives of effortless elegance. They wore livery, distinctive uniforms in family colours, that marked them as belonging to the Thynne household, creating visual continuity and discipline. Grooms managed the stables and horses, essential because travel and agriculture both depended on horsepower. They fed and watered and exercised horses daily, cleaned stables, maintained tack, prepared horses for riding or carriage work, cared for sick animals, performed all the skilled labour required to maintain the transportation infrastructure of the era. Gardeners maintained the grounds, originally formal gardens before Capability Brown's later transformation, planting and pruning and weeding, maintaining paths and parterres, creating the outdoor beauty that complemented architectural grandeur. Laundresses washed the mountains of linens and clothing a household of this scale generated daily. This was brutally hard work requiring strength and stamina, Laundry was done by hand, clothes and linens soaked in enormous tubs, scrubbed with harsh soap, rinsed multiple times, wrung out, hung to dry, ironed with heavy flat irons heated on stoves. The quantities were staggering: sheets and pillowcases for dozens of beds, tablecloths and napkins for every meal, towels, clothing for family and staff, all needing regular washing in an era before washing machines made laundry easy. All these people lived in Longleat, most in basement or attic quarters, sleeping in small rooms shared with others of similar rank, eating in the servants' hall, their lives governed by rigid schedules and strict hierarchies. The servants' world was as complex and stratified as the aristocratic world it served, with clear distinctions between upper servants like stewards and housekeepers, who wielded considerable authority, middle servants like footmen and ladies' maids, who had personal contact with the family, and lower servants like kitchen maids and laundry maids, who did the dirty work and rarely interacted with their employers directly. This entire elaborate social structure existed to support the comfortable life of one family. Sir John and Christian Thynne and their descendants, perhaps 10 or 15 family members waited on by 50 servants, a ratio that seems incredible to modern sensibilities, but that was normal for the aristocratic life of the period. The servants made possible the effortless elegance that characterized aristocratic existence, ensuring that food appeared without anyone needing to cook, that clothes were always clean without anyone needing to launder, that rooms were warm without anyone needing to carry coal, that every need was anticipated and met before it was even articulated. Sir John Thynne died in 1580, the same year his house was completed, as if he had been holding on just long enough to see his life's work finished. His body laid to rest in the parish church of Longbridge Deverell, where generations of Thynnes would follow, his tomb marking him as founder of the dynasty that would occupy Longleat for nearly 5 centuries. His son, Sir John Thynne the Younger, inherited, continuing his father's work, living in the house his father created, beginning the process of accumulation and modification that every generation would continue. When he died in 1604, the estate passed to his son, Sir Thomas Thynne, and so on through the generations, each inheriting not just property but identity, responsibility, tradition. This Thomas, Sir Thomas Thynne, who inherited in 1604, is claimed by some historians and family tradition to have inspired Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet through his secret marriage to Maria Audley, daughter of the family's bitter enemies. The story goes that Thomas fell in love with Maria despite the enmity between their families, that they married secretly, that when the marriage was discovered it created scandal and eventually reconciliation, echoing the plot of Shakespeare's most famous romantic tragedy. Whether Shakespeare actually knew this story and drew on it is debatable. Romeo and Juliet was written around 1594-1596, and Thomas Thynne's marriage occurred later. But the fact that the family believed this connection and promoted it speaks to how the Thynnes saw themselves, as figures of drama and romance and consequence, as people whose lives mattered enough to inspire great art. In the 17th century, Longleat hosted the great and powerful of Stuart and Commonwealth England. Sir James Thynne, inheriting in 1639 and living through the English Civil War, employed Sir Christopher Wren beginning in the 1660s to modernise and embellish the house. Wren, greatest of English architects, designer of St Paul's Cathedral rebuilt after the Great Fire of London, and dozens of London churches, mathematician and astronomer and polymath genius, brought his precision and classical taste to Longleat. Wren added the Long Gallery, a space running nearly the entire length of the house, perhaps 150 feet or more, where residents could exercise in bad weather and display art collections. Long galleries were standard features of Elizabethan and Stuart great houses, serving multiple purposes: indoor walking space during England's frequent bad weather, display space for portraits creating visual genealogies, entertainment venues for parties and dances. Wren's version probably featured classical proportions, carefully calculated window placement for even natural light, restrained decoration focusing attention on the artwork displayed. He created the best gallery, probably another picture gallery or reception room, and the old library, an earlier incarnation of the great library that would be expanded by later generations. He redesigned the chapel, creating a space for religious observance that reflected Anglican theology and contemporary architectural fashion, and he built a magnificent staircase that contemporary accounts describe as one of his finest domestic works, combining structural innovation with decorative beauty, a staircase that would survive for over a century and a half until Victorian tastes destroyed it. Wren's work at Longleat represents the endless process of architectural evolution that characterized all great houses. Each generation inherited a building that reflected previous generations' tastes and needs, and each generation felt compelled to update and modify to make the house reflect their own values and aesthetics. Sometimes these changes enhanced the architecture, adding layers of interest and quality. Sometimes they destroyed irreplaceable elements, sacrificing past glories for contemporary fashion. Both processes are part of how these buildings accumulated meaning and complexity over centuries. Thomas Thynne, 1st Viscount Weymouth, inheriting in 1682, began the serious book collecting that would create Longleat's legendary library, one of the great private collections in Britain. He purchased first editions, rare manuscripts, classical texts in original languages, building a collection that announced the family's intellectual credentials as clearly as the architecture announced their wealth. Book collecting in this period was serious business for aristocrats who wanted to be taken seriously as cultivated, rather than merely rich. The collection Thomas began would be expanded by descendants for the next 2 centuries, eventually totaling over 40,000 volumes covering every field of human knowledge. His grandson Thomas Thynne, 2nd Viscount Weymouth, married Louisa Carteret, herself of aristocratic lineage, strengthening the family's social position through the strategic marriage alliances that bound the aristocracy together into an interlocking network of kinship and obligation, and their son Thomas Thynne became the first Marquess of Bath in 1789, the title that would define the family thereafter, elevating them into the highest rank of the English peerage below royal dukes. This first Marquess understood that Longleat's grounds needed to match its architecture, that the setting was as important as the building, and he hired the greatest landscape designer of the age, Lancelot Capability Brown. Capability Brown transformed Longleat's surroundings between 1757 and 1762 in one of his most significant commissions. Brown was the most influential landscape designer in English history, the man who essentially invented what became known as the English landscape garden, naturalistic parks that looked like idealized countryside, but were actually carefully constructed artifice. He earned his nickname Capability from his habit of telling potential clients that their estates had capabilities for improvement, and he certainly found capabilities at Longleat. Brown began by demolishing the formal gardens that had existed since Sir James Thynne's time in the 17th century. These were French-style parterres, geometric beds of flowers and hedges arranged in elaborate patterns, visible best from upper-floor windows, representing an older aesthetic of imposed order and human dominion over nature. They were beautiful in their way, products of thousands of hours of gardening labour to maintain pristine geometry, but they represented ideas about landscape that Brown and his generation considered outdated. In their place, Brown created naturalistic landscape, the English style he pioneered and that would spread across Europe as the height of good taste. He dammed small streams that ran through the valley to create ornamental lakes that appeared entirely natural, despite being artificial constructions. These lakes served multiple purposes: aesthetic beauty, reflection of the house, recreational opportunities for boating, habitat for waterfowl that could be hunted. The water level was carefully calculated to create pleasing proportions, and the edges were shaped to look like they had formed naturally over time. Brown planted trees in carefully calculated groupings that would mature over decades into picturesque compositions. He understood how trees grew, how different species achieved different sizes and shapes, how planted arrangements would look 30 or 50 years in the future when the trees reached maturity. He created what appeared to be natural woodlands, but were actually carefully designed plantings, mixing species for visual effect, positioning groups to frame views, leaving open spaces for contrast, creating the illusion of nature while controlling every element. He shaped the land itself through massive earth-moving projects, creating gentle undulations where the valley bottom had been flat, opening vistas by removing small hills, framing views of the house from various approaches through strategic landform modelling. This required moving thousands of tons of earth using nothing but human labour and horse-drawn carts, an enormous undertaking that demonstrated both vision and resources. He designed serpentine drives that revealed Longleat gradually as visitors approached, building anticipation through careful choreography of revelation and concealment. Rather than allowing visitors to see the house from miles away, Brown's drives curved through woodland, crossed over his new streams on elegant bridges, emerged into parkland at calculated moments, finally turning to present the house as a dramatic surprise. This theatrical approach to landscape design, the understanding that movement through space over time created sequential experiences that could be choreographed, was one of Brown's great innovations. The parkland Brown created at Longleat encompasses about 900 acres immediately surrounding the house, with thousands more acres of farmland and forest beyond. This became the setting English great houses required: sweeping parkland with specimen trees and ornamental waters, grassland grazed by deer or cattle or sheep that kept grass cropped short without requiring mowing, all creating the impression of natural countryside while actually representing intensive design and management. The park was also productive. Grazing animals provided meat, timber plantations provided wood for construction and fuel, farms generated income from crops and rents, making the estate economically functional while aesthetically beautiful. Life at Longleat in the 18th and 19th centuries, after Brown's work was complete, followed the rhythms of the aristocratic calendar and the requirements of maintaining social position. The family spent part of each year in London for the social season, roughly spring through early summer, when Parliament was sitting and aristocratic society gathered in the capital. They maintained a London house, probably in prestigious neighbourhood like Mayfair or St James's, where they hosted and attended balls and dinners and theatrical performances, where they participated in political activities, where daughters were presented at court and sons made influential connections. But Longleat remained the heart of their identity, the place that defined who they were, the estate they poured resources into maintaining and improving. They returned every year, often spending autumn and winter in residence, enjoying country pursuits that urban life could not provide. They hosted shooting parties in autumn, when gentlemen came to kill the pheasants and grouse and partridges that gamekeepers had been raising all year on the estate. These shooting parties were serious business, elaborate events requiring days of preparation, accommodating dozens of guests, providing opportunities for men to bond over sport, while conducting business and political conversations informally. Christmas brought family gatherings, children and grandchildren converging on Longleat from their various homes, filling the house with noise and celebration and the intergenerational connections that maintained family cohesion. The house would be decorated with evergreen boughs and berries, fires would blaze in every hearth, enormous meals would be served, children would perform theatricals, adults would exchange gifts and catch up on family news. These celebrations combined religious observance with secular festivity, creating annual traditions that bonded families together and created the nostalgia that would motivate future generations to preserve Longleat at almost any cost. Summer meant garden parties and tours of the grounds, exploiting Brown's landscape to maximum social advantage. Guests would stroll the paths Brown created, pausing at cunningly positioned viewpoints to admire prospects he had designed, boating on his lakes, exploring his woodlands, discussing politics and literature, and the gossip that constituted aristocratic social currency. The house itself would be opened for tours, not to the public as would happen later, but to invited guests of appropriate social standing, people who could appreciate the architecture and collections while understanding the social hierarchies being performed. The second Marquess of Bath, inheriting in 1797, employed Geoffrey Wyattville in the 1820s to modernise the house yet again. Wyattville had established himself as the leading architect for aristocratic alterations through his work on Windsor Castle for George IV, where he transformed the medieval fortress into the romantic Gothic castle we see today. Bringing similar confidence and willingness to reshape inherited architecture to Longleat, Wyattville demolished parts of the house that displeased him, including Wren's magnificent staircase, replacing them with galleries and a new grand staircase more suited to 19th century taste. This decision to destroy Wren's staircase demonstrates both the confidence and arrogance of Victorian aristocracy. They felt perfectly comfortable obliterating work by England's greatest architect if it didn't suit their preferences. To them, Longleat was not a museum or historical monument, but a living house that needed to serve contemporary requirements. If that meant losing irreplaceable architecture, so be it. From a modern preservation perspective, this seems tragic, barbaric even. But we must understand it in context. The Victorians were doing exactly what Wren had done, what the first Marquess had done when hiring Brown, what every generation had done, updating their inheritance to meet current standards. Wyattville also built the Orangery, an elegant neoclassical structure where exotic plants could be grown and displayed, and numerous outbuildings that created the service infrastructure a Victorian great house required. The Orangery represents the Victorian passion for botany and horticulture, for collecting rare plants from around the expanding British Empire, for creating controlled environments where tropical and subtropical species could survive English winters. Orangeries were status symbols, expensive buildings requiring sophisticated heating systems, displaying both wealth and cultivation. The architect Humphrey Repton advised on further landscape improvements during this period, though his influence at Longleat was less dramatic than Brown's had been. Repton was Brown's successor as England's leading landscape designer, but where Brown created sweeping parkland, Repton favoured bringing some flower gardens back closer to the house, creating more intimate planted areas that complemented Brown's distant views. His recommendations probably included creating terraced gardens near the house, improving paths and drives, adding ornamental plantings that softened the transition between architecture and landscape. The fourth Marquess of Bath, inheriting in 1837 and living until 1896, collected Italian art with passion and discrimination, filling Longleat with paintings and sculptures from the Renaissance and Baroque periods. This was the great age of British aristocratic collecting, when families with resources could acquire masterpieces on the European art market, when the disruptions of the Napoleonic Wars and subsequent political upheavals made artworks available that would never have been sold previously. The fourth Marquess employed agents in Italy to identify and acquire paintings by important artists, sculptures from important periods, building a collection that rivals those in major museums. He employed John Crace to create the Italian Renaissance Revival interiors that still dazzle visitors, turning Longleat's staterooms into Victorian fantasies of Cinquecento splendour. Crace was the leading decorative artist of the mid-Victorian period, having worked on Brighton Pavilion for George IV, creating those extraordinary Orientalist interiors that transformed a seaside house into an Indian fantasy. He worked at Chatsworth House, decorating rooms for the Duke of Devonshire. He worked on the Palace of Westminster after fire destroyed the old Parliament buildings, contributing to the Gothic Revival interiors that defined Victorian public architecture. At Longleat, Crace created rooms of overwhelming visual richness, walls covered in gilded moulding dividing surfaces into panels and frames, paint in colours more vivid than restrained English taste typically allowed, ceilings exploding with decoration, creating spaces that felt more Mediterranean than British. These were the glory days, the high Victorian period, when British aristocracy reached its apogee of wealth and confidence, when Longleat entertained royalty and cabinet ministers and international celebrities, when the estate supported hundreds of families in surrounding villages through employment and tenant farming, when the Marquess of Bath was one of the great magnates of England whose opinions mattered in politics and society. But empires fall, and fortunes change, and the 20th century would test the Thynne family as no previous era had. The fifth Marquess, Thomas Thynne, inherited in 1896 and presided over Longleat through catastrophic changes that destroyed the world he was born into. He lived through 2 world wars that killed millions and bankrupted nations, through the Great Depression that devastated economies worldwide, through social and political transformations that ended aristocratic dominance of British life. During World War I, the house became a temporary hospital, grand rooms filled with iron beds holding wounded soldiers, young men shattered by industrial warfare recuperating in spaces built for balls and banquets. The contrast must have been surreal and heartbreaking, aristocratic splendour converted to utilitarian medical function, the sounds of suffering replacing music and laughter. But this was how British aristocracy contributed to the war effort, offering their homes for military use, sacrificing comfort and privacy for national service. During World War II, Longleat housed the Royal School for Daughters of Officers of the Army, evacuated from London for safety from German bombing. Young girls whose fathers were fighting slept in Victorian bedrooms, studied in libraries and galleries, played in Capability Brown's grounds, experiencing this extraordinary house as temporary refuge during their nation's greatest crisis. An American military hospital was also constructed on the estate grounds, prefabricated buildings sprouting like mushrooms across parkland, treating soldiers preparing for D-Day and wounded men returning from France after the invasion. When the 6th Marquess, Henry Thynne, inherited in 1946 after his father's death, he faced catastrophe that made wartime disruptions seem manageable by comparison. Death duties, the inheritance tax the British government imposed on large estates, took nearly 70% of the assessed value of everything he inherited. The numbers were staggering, running into hundreds of thousands of pounds at 1946 values, millions or tens of millions in modern terms. These taxes were due immediately, payable in cash, with only limited time to raise funds. To pay these crushing taxes, the 6th Marquess was forced to sell vast tracts of land, farms that had been in the family for centuries, forests planted by his ancestors, properties across England and Scotland that had generated the income streams necessary to maintain Longleat in proper style. He sold and sold, watching the estate shrink from perhaps 20,000 acres to 10,000 to 5,000, seeing the economic foundation of aristocratic life eroding beneath him, knowing that even these sales might not be enough. Longleat House itself, the building and its immediate parkland of 900 acres, was too important to sell, too central to family identity and heritage. This was the house Sir John Thynne built in the 1570s, that Christopher Wren modified in the 1660s, that Capability Brown landscaped in the 1750s, that Wyattville updated in the 1820s, that had been continuously occupied by the same family for nearly 400 years. Selling it would mean the end of the dynasty, the failure of everything generations of Thynnes had worked to build and maintain, but maintaining it seemed financially impossible. The house required constant repairs that cost thousands of pounds annually. The roof alone, thousands of square feet of lead sheeting and slate tiles and timber support structures, demanded re-leading and maintenance that could cost £5,000 or £10,000 every few years. Stone facades needed repointing where mortar deteriorated. Windows needed restoration. Interior plasterwork cracked and required repair. Collections needed conservation. The grounds required full-time staff just to prevent decay into wilderness. Even if the family lived modestly by aristocratic standards, occupying just a few rooms and closing off most of the house, the basic costs of preventing collapse exceeded what the diminished estate could generate in income. The 6th Marquess could not afford to live in Longleat, could not afford to maintain it, could not afford to keep it in the family that had owned it for 4 centuries. He faced the choice that confronted dozens of aristocratic families in post-war Britain: abandon the house to demolition or decay, or find some new way to make it pay for itself. The solution he chose in 1949 was revolutionary and controversial, a decision that changed British heritage conservation forever. He opened Longleat to the public on a commercial basis, the first stately home in Britain to do so, transforming private palace into tourist attraction, inviting ordinary citizens to pay admission fees and walk through rooms that had been exclusively aristocratic domain for 400 years. This was not the occasional charitable tour that some houses had offered for years, where aristocrats grudgingly showed a few rooms to visitors once or twice a year as noblesse oblige. This was full-scale commercial operation with regular opening hours, printed admission tickets, publicity campaigns in newspapers, guidebooks for sale, tea rooms serving refreshments, gift shops selling souvenirs, everything necessary to make Longleat a competitive attraction in the emerging leisure and tourism industry. The aristocracy was horrified. Opening one's house to paying visitors was seen as grotesque commercialism, as betraying everything that made aristocratic life valuable, as reducing noble heritage to mere entertainment for the masses. Critics called it the end of civilization, the reduction of sacred spaces to tourist spectacles, the prostitution of heritage for profit. Other aristocrats who faced similar financial pressures watched the sixth Marquess with mix of fascination and disgust, curious whether this radical experiment could succeed, but unwilling to follow his example unless absolutely forced to. But the sixth Marquess had no choice and no time for sentiment or social niceties. Death duties had to be paid, the house had to be maintained, or it would decay beyond recovery. Opening to the public was Longleat's last chance at survival, the only way the family could remain in the house their ancestors built. If that meant abandoning aristocratic privacy and dignity, so be it. Survival mattered more than pride. The response from the public exceeded all expectations and transformed British tourism. People came in thousands, ordinary British families who had never seen inside an aristocratic house, Americans on cultural tours eager to experience English heritage, foreign tourists attracted by the novelty. They paid their shillings and walked through rooms that had been private for 400 years, gaping at the artwork and furniture and architecture, imagining lives of unthinkable wealth and privilege, taking photographs and buying guidebooks and returning home to tell friends about this extraordinary experience. The sixth Marquess, who had feared that opening Longleat would destroy what made it valuable, discovered instead that sharing it created new value. Visitors appreciated the house in ways family members had stopped noticing after generations of familiarity. They marveled at details, asked questions that forced research and discovery, brought enthusiasm that was infectious. The income from admissions was substantial, not enough to restore Longleat to full glory immediately, but enough to keep the roof repaired and the walls painted, enough to begin conservation work on collections, enough to prevent the catastrophic decay that threatened. Within a few years, dozens of other aristocratic families had followed Longleat's example, opening their houses to offset maintenance costs and death duties. The National Trust, that charitable organisation founded in 1895 to preserve historic properties, began accepting stately homes from families who could no longer maintain them privately, operating them as visitor attractions while allowing donors to continue residing in portions of the buildings. An entire infrastructure emerged around heritage tourism, guidebooks and tours and publicity, transforming how Britain valued and experienced its architectural past. But the sixth Marquess understood that simply opening the doors was not enough for long-term success. Longleat needed attractions beyond the house itself, needed reasons for families to choose it over dozens of other stately homes now competing for tourist pounds, needed ways to generate excitement and publicity that would keep visitor numbers growing. The solution came in 1965 from an unexpected source: Jimmy Chipperfield, the famous circus owner and animal trainer, who proposed creating a safari park at Longleat, the first drive-through animal park outside Africa. The idea seemed insane, genuinely mad, importing African lions and elephants and giraffes to Wiltshire, allowing visitors to drive their own cars through paddocks of dangerous animals, creating controlled wilderness in the middle of the English countryside. The risks were obvious. Animals might escape and terrorize the region. Visitors might be attacked or killed. The whole enterprise might be illegal under laws never written to contemplate such scenarios. Insurance would be expensive or impossible to obtain. Local authorities would surely object. The established zoo industry would oppose competition from this unproven model. But the sixth Marquess, now in his 60s, recognized brilliance when he heard it. Safari parks were becoming popular in Africa as tourism alternatives to traditional zoos, offering visitors semi-wild animal encounters, impossible in barred enclosures. Bringing that concept to Britain would be genuinely unprecedented, creating an attraction that could put Longleat permanently on the map, generating publicity impossible to buy with conventional marketing. The financial investment was substantial but manageable if phased properly. The risks were real, but could be managed with proper planning and professional animal handlers. The planning took over a year. Chipperfield negotiated with British authorities to establish legal framework for this unprecedented venture. Paddocks were constructed in Capability Brown's parkland, using the existing landscape but adding fencing and shelters and infrastructure. Animals were sourced from Africa and other locations, transported to Britain under difficult conditions. This was before modern animal transport, requiring creativity and improvisation. Local people were sceptical and worried, imagining lions roaming Wiltshire villages, but gradually the project won support through careful public relations and demonstrated safety measures. The Longleat Safari Park opened in April 1966, and it was a sensation from the first day. Families drove through gates into the lion enclosure, where African lions lounged on the grass exactly as they might on the Serengeti, where massive male lions with dark manes approached cars and peered through windows, where lionesses crossed roads with cubs following, where these most dangerous predators existed, just feet from visitors separated only by car windows and the animals' training. Beyond the lions, visitors encountered giraffes bending their impossible necks to peer into car windows, their long tongues reaching to take proffered food. Elephants crossed roads with majestic indifference, massive bodies swaying, trunks exploring anything within reach, zebras grazed in herds, rhinos wallowed in mud. Monkeys climbed over vehicles, pulling off windshield wipers and antennas and mirrors, mischievous primates treating cars as jungle gyms, creating equal parts delight and frustration among visitors who discovered the real cost of monkey encounters. It was thrilling and slightly terrifying, and utterly unlike anything else in Britain. The publicity was overwhelming and sustained. Newspapers ran photos of lions at Longleat, front-page images of British families in ordinary cars face-to-face with African predators. Television cameras filmed visitors screaming with delight and fear as big cats approached. The safari park became instant cultural phenomenon, discussed everywhere, attracting visitors from across Britain and internationally. The financial impact was immediate and dramatic. Admission numbers soared to levels that seemed impossible years earlier. Families came to see both the house and the animals, staying all day, buying food and souvenirs, returning year after year as children grew and wanted to re-experience the magic. The safari park generated income that not only saved Longleat, but allowed serious restoration work to begin on the house. Roofs were replaced with proper materials after decades of temporary repairs. Stonework was cleaned and repointed. Collections were professionally conserved. Gardens were restored to something approaching their historical appearance. The 6th Marquess had found the formula for survival: combine heritage with entertainment, give people experiences they could not get elsewhere, never stop innovating. The 7th Marquess, Alexander Thynne, inheriting in 1992 after his father's death, embraced this entrepreneurial spirit, while adding his own eccentric touches that made him one of Britain's most colourful aristocrats. He was an artist and muralist, covering walls of the private family apartments with elaborate paintings featuring dozens or hundreds of women, figures from his life and imagination, creating controversial art that shocked traditionalists who believed historic houses should remain unchanged. He was obsessed with mazes and labyrinths, seeing them as symbolic structures representing life's complexities and spiritual journeys. He commissioned the Longleat hedge maze that opened in 1975, designed by maze specialist Greg Bright, that became one of the world's longest and most complex hedge mazes. With 1.69 miles of pathway winding through walls of yew bushes, 16,000 individual plants creating barriers, 6 raised footbridges allowing frustrated visitors to see the layout from above, a central tower offering views over the entire puzzle. The maze became a attraction in itself, drawing maze enthusiasts from around the world. He continued adding mazes, each with different designs and challenges. The Love Labyrinth, the Sun Maze, the Lunar Labyrinth, King Arthur's Maze, each represented different themes and solving strategies, turning Longleat into destination for people passionate about these complex puzzles. The 7th Marquess understood that diversifying attractions reduced dependence on any single element, created reasons for repeat visits, appealed to varied interests within families. He was also personally flamboyant in ways that kept Longleat in tabloid newspapers. He openly conducted relationships he called wifelets, multiple partners living on the estate, rejecting conventional marriage models for polyamorous arrangements that scandalized conservative opinion. He decorated parts of the house with his murals regardless of historical propriety, asserting that Longleat was living house, not museum. He gave interviews where he discussed his beliefs in free love and spirituality and conspiracy theories, subjects that made the aristocracy wince but kept Longleat visible in popular culture. But beneath the eccentricity, he was a serious businessman who understood that Longleat's survival required constant innovation and investment. He continued expanding the safari park, adding new species, cheetahs and koalas, and spotted hyenas among the more recent arrivals. He added adventure playgrounds and boat rides and exhibitions, creating full-day experiences that justified higher admission prices. He hosted concerts and events, using Longleat's dramatic setting for everything from classical music to motorsports. He leased 400 acres to Centre Parks for a holiday village that brings thousands more visitors to the area, generating rent while creating synergies with Longleat's attractions. Under his stewardship, Longleat became one of Britain's top tourist attractions, drawing over 500,000 visitors annually at peak, employing hundreds of staff, generating millions in revenue that maintained the estate and funded continuous improvements. The business model the sixth Marquess pioneered had matured into sophisticated operation, balancing heritage conservation with commercial requirements, preserving the past while embracing the future. In January 1995, disaster struck when thieves broke into Longleat and stole a Titian painting worth over £5 million. Rest on the Flight into Egypt, painted by the Venetian master in the 16th century, depicted the Holy Family resting during their escape to Egypt, a religious subject rendered with Titian's characteristic mastery of colour and composition. The painting had hung in the drawing room for generations, casually displayed among dozens of other artworks, protected only by Longleat's isolation and the assumption that no one would dare steal from such a prominent house. The theft devastated the family and shocked the art world. How could such a valuable work disappear from a house that hosted thousands of visitors weekly? The investigation went nowhere for years despite international alerts and insurance company involvement. The painting seemed to have vanished completely, presumably stolen to order by a collector willing to own masterpiece that could never be publicly displayed or sold legitimately. Then, in 2002, 7 years after the theft, police received an anonymous tip leading them to a plastic shopping bag at a bus stop in London. Inside, wrapped in newspaper, was the Titian, recovered undamaged through circumstances that remain mysterious. Someone apparently got scared holding such hot property, or a deal fell through, or conscience intervened. The painting returned to Longleat, now displayed with much greater security, sophisticated alarms and surveillance systems and climate control that should have existed all along. The recovery was a minor miracle. Most stolen art never returns, and the Titian's survival reminds us that even in the 21st century, Longleat remains a private home filled with irreplaceable treasures requiring constant vigilance. The current Marquess, Seolin Thin, inherited in 2020 when his father Alexander died, from COVID-19 complications, one of the pandemic's many victims. Seolin, the 8th Marquess, born in 1974, represents a new generation of aristocratic entrepreneurship shaped by modern business education and contemporary values. Unlike previous Marquesses who inherited with little preparation and learned on the job, Seolin had been managing Longleat's business operations for years before inheriting, holding executive positions, understanding profit and loss statements and marketing strategies, and human resource management. Under his leadership, Longleat continues evolving to meet contemporary expectations while preserving historical integrity. The safari park has expanded with new species and improved habitats reflecting modern understanding of animal welfare. Visitor facilities have been enhanced with better restaurants and shops and accessibility features. Educational programs engage school groups, teaching conservation and history and architecture to young people. The house undergoes continuous conservation, addressing deferred maintenance while researching and restoring historical details. The estate has been used extensively as film location, generating income while raising Longleat's profile internationally. It appeared in Doctor Who episodes in the 1970s and 1980s, for 30 years hosting a Doctor Who exhibition that attracted fans worldwide. It provided locations for the Bollywood film Mohabbatain in 2000, introducing Longleat to massive Indian audiences. It appeared in television series industry in 2024, showing that the house remains cinematically attractive across genres and decades. Today, Longleat stands as perhaps the most successful example of aristocratic adaptation to modern realities in Britain. The house has been continuously occupied by the same family for nearly 5 centuries, one of the longest unbroken ownerships in British history. The estate still encompasses 10,000 acres of parkland, farmland and forest, still substantial despite post-war sales necessitated by death duties. The safari park now houses over 500 animals representing species from around the world, maintained to high welfare standards. The hedge maze challenges visitors with its complexity. The house displays 4 centuries of art and furniture and architecture, preserved and interpreted for public benefit. Over 500,000 people visit Longleat annually, making it consistently one of Britain's top tourist destinations, generating revenue that not only maintains the estate, but allows continuous improvement and expansion. The business operates year-round now with seasonal variations, employing hundreds of staff in various capacities, from animal keepers to tour guides to maintenance workers to administrative personnel. It has become a significant regional employer, economic engine for surrounding communities, preserving not just historic house but supporting modern livelihoods. This economic impact was part of what the 6th Marquess envisioned when he opened to the public in 1949, the idea that heritage conservation and economic development could be mutually supporting rather than contradictory. The story of Longleat is ultimately about survival and adaptation, about refusing to accept decline as inevitable, about choosing innovation over tradition when tradition meant death. Sir John Thynne built Longleat in the 1570s to announce his family's arrival among England's elite, creating architecture that would impress and intimidate and inspire, establishing dynasty that would last centuries. His vision succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined. His descendants lived in that house for nearly 400 years, accumulating art and books and prestige, marrying into other aristocratic families, serving in Parliament and military and royal court, embodying the British upper class at its apex of power and privilege. They modified the house repeatedly, each generation adding their mark, creating the layers of architecture and decoration and meaning that make Longleat fascinating to study. They survived civil wars and regime changes and social transformations, adapting as necessary while maintaining core identity. When the 20th century destroyed their world through war and taxation and social change, when the old ways became impossible to maintain, when aristocratic privilege faced democratic challenge and economic reality, the Thinnes adapted again. The 6th Marquess made the courageous decision to open Longleat to the public in 1949, enduring criticism from his own class, pioneering model that would preserve not just Longleat, but dozens of other great houses. His son Alexander doubled down on commercial innovation, creating the safari park that made Longleat internationally famous, demonstrating that heritage and entertainment could coexist productively. The current Marquess continues this tradition of entrepreneurial adaptation while maintaining the conservation standards that preserve irreplaceable heritage for future generations. They chose life over dignity, future over past, survival over pride, and in doing so, they preserved something irreplaceable. Stand in Longleat's Great Hall today, and you are standing where Sir John Thynne stood in 1580, newly moved into his masterpiece, surveying what he had created and imagining the dynasty that would follow. Walk through rooms where Christopher Wren worked his genius in the 1660s, where Capability Brown planned his landscapes in the 1750s, where Victorian marquesses entertained royalty in the 1800s, where 20th century marquesses invented new models for heritage conservation. Drive through parkland where lions roam and giraffes graze, African savanna impossibly transplanted to Wiltshire through desperation and imagination and entrepreneurial courage. Navigate the hedge maze that represents one eccentric marquess's obsession with symbolic pathways and spiritual journeys. Tour the safari park that saved the estate and changed British tourism. Buy souvenirs in gift shops occupying converted stables. Eat lunch in restaurants serving thousands daily. Experience Longleat not as frozen museum but as living place still evolving, still inhabited by the family that built it, still adapting to survive. Longleat endures as testimony to the power of architecture to transcend time and changing contexts. It demonstrates the resilience of families who refuse to quit when facing impossible odds. It proves that heritage and commerce can coexist without either being diminished. It shows that the past and present need not conflict, but can inform and enhance each other. It reminds us that survival sometimes requires abandoning what we thought was essential to preserve what truly matters. Sir John Thynne dreamed of founding a dynasty that would last for generations, of creating architecture that would announce his family's importance, of establishing a legacy that would transcend his own mortality. 5 centuries later, his dream survives, transformed beyond anything he could have imagined, but surviving nonetheless, a golden palace in green hills where lions sleep beneath English oaks, where visitors from around the world come to experience layers of history and innovation and adaptation that make Longleat unique among English great houses, where the story continues with no end in sight.